Marc Daniel Nelson here on behalf of Pulsar Modular. Today I have very exciting news about a new plugin I'm developing with Ziad at Pulsar Modular called the P821 MDN TAPE. It's based on my personal machine, the Stevens 821 from the old Producer's Workshop in Hollywood, California, known for some super great records like Pink Floyd The Wall, Steely Dan Asia, Fleetwood Mac Rumors, Ringo Starr, Goodnight Vienna, just the list goes on and on. Back in early 2022, Ziad and myself had a real long talk about trying to figure out how to make a tape plugin that was different than everything out there. And I always said, if you're going to do it, you got to do it on a Stevens machine, because the Stevens 821 was known for being the best in tons and tons of camps. The Stevens 821 was such a huge favorite to many engineers and producers because of the way it was reproducing the sound. It made things sound absolutely huge compared to other machines. Part of the quirks with the machine is what made it very cool. It had very little electronics. It had 0 transformers. So you were allowed to get a massive amount of level on the tape without using Dolby or NR. And it just translated so well as a sonic character. If you go back and listen to like The Wall or Asia or Rumors in general, you get this sense of giant size space. The transients are a lot better sounding than a lot of the records in that era. And there's a reason why it's so sought after. So when Ziad and I decided to do a plugin, we went through a lot of different tests to just go through what makes a machine special. Now, a lot of it could be the harmonic content. You know, you're listening to these other machines out there and you're getting a lot of tone from the transformers and the electronics. But what made the 821 unique was none of that. It just gave you the sound of the tape, which in turn is special on its own and creates this unbelievably larger, massive, very wide, beautiful open tone, known for those records and that sound. Going back into like the development of this thing, it took a ton of time, because it wasn't one of those things where it was just a linear sound. When you're trying to get sampling of a machine, you're doing all these different tests in turn, thinking you're putting it in and it's coming back. And you're observing how the machine is relating, like technically the electronics, to what you're throwing in and how it's giving you. With tape, it's totally random. And it could be so random that it drives you completely up the wall, which it did for a year. This wasn't one of those things where we were able to kind of sample the machine, do all of our tests, and then take those tests, implement them into a digital audio workstation format where you're putting music through it. It just works, because unlike any other tape plugin, the 821 here is very random sounding, and it sounds extremely unique because under the hood, again, there's all these elements of randomizing, but causing it to sound so big and special still, which is why it is not like any other tape plugin on the market. I think the hardest thing we took away from getting this machine converted into the digital realm was just the freedom of uncongested sound. And when you're listening to tape, if you had the pleasure to be able to listen to tape growing up or anything like that, you would notice that things just sounded like wider in the speakers than normal. And it wasn't necessarily a width thing as much as it just sounded like it was out of the speakers, where it was behind the speakers and like out of the speakers, just bigger than life. And it just wasn't coming across that way in other plugins. And our first tests, it wasn't either. So it just took a ton of time to just go through our little building block process to really get it close. And then all of a sudden, it just clicked. And when we were on the 900 formula, it clicked really quickly. And then when we got to 456, it took quite a bit of time again. And we were all excited. And then all of a sudden, we changed the music. And then all of a sudden, everything fell apart again. So I introduce you to the P821 MDN tape. So my machine was originally from the Producer's Workshop in the 70s and 80s. It was a 24-track, 2-inch machine that Stevens built in early 70s. And the weirdest part about the Stevens stuff is he was building 40-track 2-inch machines at the same time, and it just never caught on really well. And on top of it, it's extremely light as a machine. Like literally the actual machine I can take into my car. I can pull the transporter and put it over my head. It's so light. The way it was built with the very low electronics and stuff. So the GUI here. In the first look, you see you have obviously a stereo tape machine. We felt that even though this was a 2-inch machine, what was smart was instead of kind of modeling 5 or 10 or 24 different channels, we just wanted to keep it really simple and stereo or dual mono, because what was happening was there's phase issues where there's a lot of plugins out there that does these gimmicky things where you're modeling different channels, but the way that the modeling happened, you start noticing little phasing issues when you're adding it all up, which I guess in turn is analog, but I just felt like for this machine, we didn't want to do that because of all the other things that were going on underneath the hood, that we were trying to keep things relatively simple. If you look at the stereo left and right, you have your low and high shelf, you have your low and high bias, you have your formulas, your 900 and your 456, and your IPS inches per second. If I play this without music, you'll see that if I'm in 456 or if I'm in 900, it's going to change the visual of it. If I don't want to see this, or if the system is becoming too much, I can drop this down and make it even more compact by taking down the modulation section in the actual tape echo section. On this project, I think I have it on 5 tracks. I don't really like to use it on everything because, honestly, the character of tape is wonderful, but sometimes it just becomes a little too much. And I do remember back in the tape land where you just wish you could have digital inside certain things. So this allows you to be able to do and pick and choose. I think I have this on the snare drum, acoustic guitar bus, bass guitar, and the stereo bus. What that does is it gives it a really nice open sound. And what I would like to do is start pushing it a little harder. So when I'm in link mode, I can push this a little harder. And if you watch the black VU, you're going a little heavier. If you start seeing the red, that means you're starting to get into some saturation a little bit. Now, if I go and make sure that the link is on the in and out, I can actually push this a little harder, and you'll start seeing the VU respond a little bit aggressively. So you'll know that you're starting to get into saturation a little too heavy. But again, around between 18 and 12 is my favorite kind of area for the input. Another thing, if you go and you look at the shelf EQ, there's a pre and post. This totally sounds different. So if you're in pre, you're essentially putting EQ in before you hit the tape. If you're in post, this is kind of like the playback EQ. I like to keep it in the post for the stereo mix because it actually essentially is just brightening things up. If you have it on pre and you add EQ or low end, you're basically creating the saturation going into it, almost like you're pre-EQing compression. So I keep that usually on post. The bias, depending on what you're doing, it's going to do this thing where you're feeling like the material starts becoming a little aggressive or it's becoming a little more relaxed, depending on what it is. One thing for mastering people, and we put this on my 455, was this soundstage button. The soundstage button, what that does is for mastering guys that don't really want the width, even though we modeled this exact machine and it had actually a little more width than what we did, so we kind of tamed it back a little bit more. We know that there's some people that don't want that width sometimes if they're using stereo masters or whatever. So this soundstage blue click allows you to get things a little tighter. And it's actually really good for mono instruments too. I like to kind of take that off on snares and stuff because it really keeps things tight and focused. Everything else is pretty simple. The modulation is on, but the wow and flutter are kind of all the way backed off. You can end up getting really radical with the flange and stuff and the lo-fi. That's just for fun, for people that want to have fun. The tape delay is actually really great too. We spent a lot of time trying to get that as unique and original as we could because there's so many tape delay options out there. This one really sounds really terrific. Now on to something really cool that I actually want to talk a little bit about because Ziad and I spent quite a bit of time trying to get this perfected, which is, as silly as it is, the hiss. Now the tape hiss, if you listen, if I just stop everything and I make sure that the hiss dim is off, what the hiss dim is actually doing is when you're on stop, there's no hiss. So when you hit the transport and it starts, the hiss will start ramping up again. This is just for an annoyance for people. But for right now, if I turn it off and I turn the hiss up, make it real loud. The one thing I can tell you, unlike any other tape plugin, which I feel like the hiss that people put on other tape plugins, it just sounds like white noise, and it's actually aggressive when you put it against like high frequency sources and stuff. We spent a lot of time trying to model this hiss to be very engaging and inviting, and actually helps the source quite a bit. And I use it quite a bit. I do feel like by putting that into stuff, it really does add the depth, because part of the tape sound that we're missing is that sound of the hiss and the way that the music sits inside of it. And anyone that grew up with analog tapes or whatever, when you used to listen to like music fade out, the hiss would just basically just consume the entire music track. And you almost felt like it was kind of part of that sound. So we spent quite a bit of time trying to get that hiss really good and inviting as well. This is a band from Norway called We Met in June. Really great band. They are really, really fun to work with because they're really all about the songwriting and getting things to sound kind of familiar, but very kind of unique and original to where they're at. Really fun. Before we go too far against stuff, let's just listen to the track itself.
Half asleep, you're steady at the wheel. Baby, it's us against the world.
Off.
Rounding every turn, I'm in and out of a dream. Rain hammering the windshield, living life as I should. Never thought I would.
Polarizing a little too hard there.
I see a million fireflies, wanna ride with you until the night.
Soundstage off.
Lights passing by. This is what feels right, wanna ride with you all my life.
Now listen to the kick drum between the two formulas, 900, 456, you can really hear it in the drums.
Used to feel it more like a curse, but when the mountains curve,
spreading out a little wider.
Bend down above me, and our eyes they meet. Baby, you have a way with words. I'll be yours forever.
30.
Looking at the sky.
A little bit cleaner, a little more open. I'm not going to get terribly into the modulation or the tape delay. I know there's going to be a lot of guys out there that will probably do their own video release on this. They can play around with the tape stuff. Today, what I'm just doing is showing you my favorite features of the plugin, putting it on the stuff that I think it really shines on. Obviously, it shines on vocals and stuff, but it depends on the track. Sometimes it doesn't need that. Sometimes the vocal sounds great as is. In Digital Lamb, you don't just slap on a tape thing instinctively just because you think it's going to make it better. Sometimes it just doesn't need it. So use your ears on that for sure. But on this track, it needed it on the drums a little bit, the snare, to get the snare to poke out a little better, to add a little bit more of that body that I really like that tape does to snare drums. The bass guitar added a little more growl. And the acoustic guitar bus, it added this really beautiful sheen, which we were trying to kind of go for that Fleetwood Mackie acoustic guitar, high-strung kind of thing mixed with the six string. And when you put that on the global, it just kind of adds this beautiful sheen. And then on the stereo bus that we actually have been listening to here. So let's listen to it on the drums a little bit and figure out what it's doing on the snare drum. Sounds like a snare. It's great. Let's add it. It's doing that very familiar thing that I'm not hearing on other tape plugins, which is adding some body without compressing it. A lot of these tape plugins are putting compressors or doing something in it, and maybe it's modeling the transformer. Maybe that's what it really is. But it's adding just a little too much flick to the sound for my taste. And what we got out of this is just this beautiful, big, open sound. Now, obviously, if you're hitting it hard, if you hit tape hard, it's going to start collapsing and distorting. But let's take it off. It makes things sit back a little bit. This just makes things sit forward, but it also puts things in a beautiful place. So pulling up the whole drum set. This is just snare. Off. That lifeless kind of sound that you're not getting that alive feel. Now remember, we also have it on the stereo bus as we speak, so it's still processing the drums. But by putting it on the snare alone, it just pokes it out a little bit without it sounding like compression. And it's not really addressing or creating any problems in the cymbals either, which is always a really cool thing. Let's move on to bass. On the bass, you see that I have it on 456, 15 IPS. Soundstage again is off. I backed off the bias a little bit on the low end because I wanted to get a little less congestion. And I feel like when you're kind of throttling those a little bit on the bias, you can kind of open the sound up a little bit without changing the kind of character of the sound. Add a little bit of the top end, pull back some of the low end, and we are hitting it around, again, a little hotter on this one, so a little bit over 12, between 12 and 10. Here's it with off. It's a little more flicky, a little more clinky. On. Sounds great with it off, but with it on, it's kind of marrying again. It's really marrying with the drums. '15 has that beautiful bump. 900 is pretty cool. That's a preference thing again. 456 for me on this track just feels really good on bass. Let's listen to it on acoustic guitar. Talking about the acoustics on this song, I mentioned Fleetwood Mac because there's a couple of high strungs, there's some six strings and stuff like that. The sound of the 70s to me, with that kind of Southern California rock, acoustic guitars were so prominent. There's a lot of hard kind of scraping and stuff like that was happening. And when you're compressing acoustic guitars, again, you're getting this pump factor that makes things sound sometimes smaller. And the way that tape used to hold guitars very clean and add this beautiful, almost like lacquer sheen, we were able to really get that on this, which was really exciting because on our first test was acoustic instruments and we weren't able to get that kind of sheen the way that we wanted on acoustic guitars. Now here, if you see our soundstage is back on because this is a stereo bus, I have the bias turned down and a little bit of the high too because I felt we're kind of relaxing the acoustic guitar. We're maybe adding a little bit of the top end, pulling back a little bit of the low end, and 456 and 15. I'm going to take off first, and we're going to listen and see what we got. Sounds pretty good. Now if we put it in and see what it sounds like. You're taming the guitar peaks without adding a ton of compression, essentially. through is just the sound of the electronics, the very little electronics that are in it, and not necessarily the sound of the repo, the tape, post going on the actual heads through the machine and going on the tape. Pull in the drums and bass. This is with it off, just on the acoustic guitars. Again, you're noticing the acoustics are kind of sitting backwards and they're not necessarily staying up front. Put compression on it to do that, but then it starts sounding choked and stuff. What this does on its own just naturally keeps things in place and glues it. I hate to use that word glue, but it does do the glue sound. $900 is pretty cool. For some reason, maybe because it's the era, but the 456 does have a sound that we really, really were liking to lean into pretty good on this track. The whole track together,
Whatever that means, used to feel it more.
I do have it on the vocal bus of the backgrounds too.
I just wanna ride with you into the night.
Pull that up.
Lights passing by. This is what feels right. Wanna ride with you all my life. Looking at the sky, I see a million fireflies. Wanna ride.
The cool thing that we found when we were modeling the machine was the really inaccurate and odd behavior of the top frequencies and the super low frequencies. Obviously, if you're starting to put scopes on this or plug-in doctor or whatever the heck is very popular with people now, they want to see what it's doing. You're going to see all these kind of interesting things happening at 10K and above. Right around 20K, things start getting really funky and weird, but that really adds to the personality of the machine. That's usually with the modulation on. Take that off, you're not going to get that nearly aggressive. Even with the wow and flutter off and down, you still get these really weird inconsistencies in the top frequencies.
Looking at the sky, I see a million fireflies.
Just a very airy sound.
With you into the night. Light passing by. This is what feels right. Wanna ride with you all my life.
Propping things up just enough, again, without it sounding too overcompressed. It just sounds very airy. And honestly, that's pretty much all I can say about the machine and the plugin that hasn't already been said in other promotion or in other videos. It's just been a long time in the making, and I'm extremely excited to finally send it out to the world because it's doing something that no other plugin can do. I'm really excited to hear what people think and how they can actually break this and make it sound completely unique and different. Thank you for watching, and happy mixing.